It's almost like the traditional tech companies like Alibaba, which is it's kind of like old tech, got too big. They were seen as expanding too fast and were seen as a threat. The new national champions are things like Xiaomi and also DeepSeek.
China is holding its annual National People's Congress. It's a huge and largely ceremonious gathering of Communist Party officials, a time for the country's leadership to take stock of the current economic situation and signal its plans for the future. My colleague Clifford Coonan has been keeping a close eye on it and is here to fill us in on what we need to know. Clifford, good to have you with us. Now, you spent years living in China and you would go to this event every single year. What is it like? What does it feel like being there?
I think I covered about 15 of these events over the years living in China. It's fascinating and it's also incredibly tedious. It's a massive gathering. What actually happens there is relatively meaningless because everything has been arranged in advance. However, power in China is a black box. We don't know what goes on in there. The only way we can find out what is happening at the top levels of power in China is by interpreting things at things like the National People's Congress. It's once a year our opportunity to get a feel for what's going on in China. And that involves doing things like counting the number of people who walk out to see how many people will be on the standing committee, which is the upper level of Communist Party power, or where people are sitting to see who is in a senior position. You do all this kind of interpretation. So it's fascinating. But the actual day-to-day stuff is just people reading out speeches. Yesterday, this week, so it opens with the government work report, which is read out by the Premier, and that's Li Qiang at the moment. That used to be the opening, and then Li Qiang would also close it with a press conference. The press conference is gone, and then yesterday, the government work report, which could go on for an hour, has now been cut down to bullet points. So you get less and less of a window into this black box of power, but it's still all we have. So we spend a lot of time trying to interpret what direction the Chinese economy is going to take for the next year, often even for the next 5 years, because it also lays the groundwork for the 5-year plan, which decides how the Communist Party decides how the economy is going to work. So it's a fascinating event. It's a massive hall, the Great Hall of the People. You have to use binoculars a lot of the time from up in the press box. It's got this huge star on the ceiling. It's a real pageant rather than a parliament as such, because decisions aren't made. But it's a symbol of power. It's political theatre, probably at the most spectacular you'll see.
It sounds like you have to do a lot of reading between the lines to notice what's different from one year to the next. Now, one thing that they did reiterate at this year's event was this growth target of 5%. There are a lot of structural weaknesses in the Chinese economy right now. Where is all this growth supposed to come from?
That's the question everyone is asking. It's all very well to make a target, but how do you deliver on this? A lot of the traditional sources of growth aren't there anymore for the Chinese government. The property market is still in trouble. It's stabilized a little bit, but it's still not. House prices are still falling. Investment is not going to the right areas. It's kind of reached critical mass in terms of building infrastructure, and exports are now in trouble because of the tariffs, which are at the center of the trade war between Donald Trump and China, and Donald Trump indeed and the rest of the world almost. So the traditional roots aren't there. What we've seen this year is a real focus on tech. In the run-up to this, we saw the company DeepSeek, which is a Chinese AI company which works on open source software. It came out and caused a huge stir and really excited people about Chinese tech. So we saw Xi Jinping met with the head of DeepSeek. He also met with other robotics firms, all of these kind of new industries. And the focus is on making sure that China is at the center of these new developments in tech. And that's what we saw at the National People's Congress. We've had huge tech presence.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because this year they had Lei Jun, the CEO of Xiaomi, the phone maker, give a speech there. What was his role? Why was he invited to do this?
Well, he's very interesting. I mean, Xiaomi is a very interesting company as well because it's a phone company, but it also makes electric vehicles. A lot of Chinese tech companies, for example, are battery companies that have things added on. Things that use batteries become the company. So you'll see a lot of, like BYD, the electric car company, is also a battery company. This is very interesting because a lot of the focus is on these companies. The traditional it's almost like the traditional tech companies like Alibaba, which is it's kind of like old tech, they got too big. They were seen as expanding too fast and were seen as a threat. And the founder and chief of Alibaba, Jack Ma, was famously disappeared a few years ago. He's back again, but he's clearly not the national champion that he once was. The new national champions are things like Xiaomi and also DeepSeek. So we have a lot of these. We have this new platform which is really focused on, and it's very interesting because you sort of wonder, how is it going to replace things like property? Property accounted for a third of the economy. You've got all these spin-offs and things like that. Tech is obviously very important, but ultimately most of China's exports are kind of lower tech. Electric vehicles are not, they're selling too many electric vehicles overseas. There are too many electric vehicle manufacturers now. There's 200 electric vehicle manufacturers in China, which is ridiculous because all the local governments have been told, build an electric vehicle plant because we need the revenue. But of course, it's not sustainable. Then you have the overcapacities that other countries are complaining about, like the US is saying that, and indeed the EU is saying that you're flooding our markets with these goods. So everything is kind of connected. And the focus on things like AI is very interesting because it's it doesn't have the same overcapacity issues, but at the same time, because they're all interconnected, it still means that a lot of the headaches for the Chinese economy are still there.
You mentioned Jack Ma there, and you talked about his rise and fall and perhaps some kind of rehabilitation now. But that tension between control and innovation, this is going to apply in the area of AI as well. If we look at a company like DeepSeek, it managed something nobody expected. What kind of conditions were in place that enabled this success?
Yeah, DeepSeek is very interesting. Basically, it's a very sort of, for want of a better expression, it was a wonky, sort of nerdy company. It comes out of the university. It's very, very. The founder he had a software company that did stock picking, and kind of did it as a sideline using relatively, I mean, this is by no means, this is high tech, but it was not state-of-the-art high tech. It was a couple of generations older and whatever. So in many ways, it kind of tied in with the kind of the concept of struggle. I mean, it's very difficult at the NPC. When you look at it, it's like looking at East Germany in the late 80s. You know, it's or even looking at Russia in the 80s. You know, you've got this communist, Marxist-Leninist imagery, the same language. It's all about struggle, unswerving, and talking about communist ideology. And then at the same time, you're trying to marry this concept of communist ideology with this incredible advances in high tech. So that's what Xi Jinping is trying to do at the moment. He's trying to have this new socialist vision, and which is a high tech vision with socialist characteristics. And it's really fascinating. Yeah,
I'm fascinated by how this is going to look in practice, because I'm reminded of the United States in this context, because if you look at the likes of Zuckerberg and Bezos really towing the Trump line right now and, you know, essentially parroting Trumpian ideology, is this analogous to the kind of relationship that Xi Jinping wants to have with his tech leaders?
Yeah, it's a very interesting one. I mean, there's a lot less oxygen, I think, if you're a tech leader in China, because ultimately the government has the government has degrees of influence in your company, but ultimately the government decides what happens. The Communist Party is extremely powerful in a way that the US government, even under Trump, doesn't have that kind of that kind of power. What we're seeing, of course, now emerging under Trump, and the way that the tech barons and have kind of bowed down to Trump's will, obviously that has implications for democracy, and a lot of people are very concerned about it. It's still different, and I think that the US has always managed to innovate because there's a lot more freedom there. This has always been a problem in China. At a certain point, you need to reform the system, the political system, to allow economic reform to happen. And this is a very difficult thing for the Communist Party to do, because its main function is to stay in power. So it can't introduce a lot of these political reforms, because political reform feeds into the economic aspect, if you think about it like with innovation, because you have transparency, you have freedom to move, you don't have to, the brain gets oxygen, you don't have to control everything. So the US has always benefited from the fact that it is a very free society. There's possibly a warning for what's going on in the US right now, that freedom could suffer if the great minds don't feel that they're going to be able to create. In China, there is a lot of people going back there, and there is a lot of innovation going on, but they do kind of hit a certain point where there's a bottleneck because certain things aren't allowed. I mean, a lot of the developments are in AI, but AI is very unpredictable. Everyone's talking about, nobody really knows what direction it's going, for example, and it's not, you can't manage it the way you can block a search engine. There's a lot of these issues out there at the moment that are real challenges facing the Chinese economy.
So if I'm understanding you right, the bargain in the US seems to be deregulation in exchange for a kind of ideological acceptance of Trumpian politics. But that doesn't work in China, right? Because communist ideology and free market economics are a contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, if you take Jack Ma from Alibaba, one of the reason we don't know why, because this is never publicized, but the reason why he was disappeared, or he went off the radar for a while, was that he went to a banking congress in Shanghai in which he criticized the state banks and called them dinosaurs, and he immediately disappeared afterwards. That wouldn't happen in the US, but that means that a lot of other tech titans have disappeared. For example, one of China's richest men, Pony Ma, he also was very much in the ascendant. He hasn't disappeared, but his influence is a lot less. You see a lot of these sort of elements. I think the incentive, for example, for you to really boost and grow your company is less, because I think there's the tall poppy syndrome. People are worried about putting their head over the parapet a little bit. They don't want to stand out too much. And I think that kind of fear means that ultimately, I'm not saying that China isn't innovative, but I'm saying that ultimately I think it's constrained now by a certain fear that if you don't follow the party line, that you could lose your company like Jack Ma did.
Interesting. Now, we have this big tech story on one hand, and then on the other, we have ordinary Chinese people who are not feeling very confident right now. Everywhere else in the world, we keep talking about inflation. In China, things are getting cheaper in relative terms. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, the deflation issue is a real challenge. This is related to the fact that the economy just isn't, the domestic economy isn't growing. China is selling a lot overseas. Its exports are the main thing, not the main thing, but one of the main things driving the economy. It's not being, Chinese consumers, even if prices are falling because of deflation, because of lower prices, they're not buying things, because it ties in with the fact that the property market, property is traditionally how people save money. People are worried. And that overall picture then contributes to falling prices, which is part of a broader thing about sluggishness in the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is still growing, and we're sitting in one of the third biggest economy in the world, which isn't expanding at the moment. But at the same time, the Chinese economy is growing by significantly less than it used to, and the structural issues are looking incredibly problematic. And deflation is very much one part of that picture.
The government does have a stimulus plan, doesn't it, to try to tackle this weak consumption. What's it got in the works?
This is going to be interesting to see how it unravels. Because they've mentioned that they're going to introduce stimulus. They have fiscal means. They can tweak interest rates. They can make it easier to borrow money. But overall, they have a lot less room to maneuver than they used to. The Chinese economy is enormous, and it has obviously always got power just by the sheer scale. But ultimately, it doesn't have things as good as it used to. So, and a lot of the traditional routes have already been used. You saw that you can't build any more airports. You can maybe renovate some of the existing airports, but you don't have this. You're not talking about China as a greenfield site anymore. Now you're talking about a highly developed infrastructure. So that route, for example, is closed. I imagine there will be efforts to encourage more consumption, such as where you get tax relief if you hand in your car, if you exchange your car for an electric vehicle. But again, a lot of those routes have already been used up. So I think there's going to have to be some real creativity when it comes to stimulating the domestic economy for people to start spending money as well at home, and combine that with the effect of tariffs on the export market. You're going to see some real pressure, I think.
Yeah, it's hard to make people feel confident, isn't it? You can't just tell them to, essentially. One other big headline from this year's Congress was the defence spending. It's set to increase by 7%. That's quite a big number. Where is that money going to go?
Well, there's a lot of rumours at the moment that there's a new aircraft carrier coming, and that would be, China is hoping to match its sort of economic might with influence in the region. It's obviously very influential now in the Asia-Pacific region, for example, but it has all these territorial demands. To make those territorial demands stick, it needs a big navy, for example. So they have 2 aircraft carriers at the moment. One is in sea testing at the moment. It's being, and then there's rumours that a 4th, possibly nuclear, aircraft carrier will come, and an aircraft carrier is a huge symbol of power, and a lot of the other spending will go in just beefing up the army and the Air Force in particular. A lot of focus on drones. All of these areas that it can spend, and a lot of people reckon that defence spending is probably undervalued by about 40% because there's so many different areas of society that would normally be part of the defence budget. You have, like, for example, you have the People's Armed Police, or you've various branches of the military which don't count as part of the People's Liberation Army, which is the main army. So I think you're going to see a lot of spending on part of this, of matching the economic might with this defence might.
One thing I'm really curious about is when Xi Jinping watches Trump and Putin grow ever closer, does that make him feel more or less emboldened when it comes to any sort of military aims he might have?
Well, in particular, where this relates to is Taiwan, because China has territorial. China wants to take Taiwan. China wants to take Taiwan. Taiwan is a self-ruled island of 23 million people. Does not want to be. Has consistently voted to be not part of mainland China, and when they see the way Trump is talking about Ukraine, for example, a lot of people, when the Ukraine war started, they said, look, there's an example that because the US stood up for Ukraine, that it would give China pause if it actually went and attacked Ukraine. People in Taiwan are feeling nervous now. They see that Trump appears to be folding to Putin. Putin's closeness to Xi is also they're good friends. Their alliance has been problematic for the West because Xi has tacitly supported Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So at the moment, the odds are very much stacked against Taiwan, for example, and also with other areas of territorial disputes. Suddenly countries like Japan, South Korea, they're feeling isolated because they're suddenly surrounded by a group of potentially hostile forces. Now, I'm not saying that the US is going to abandon Korea or Japan, but the sentiment is definitely changing. So, and I think and these are big economies, and these are big, powerful countries that are suddenly wrong-footed by Trump's recent utterances.
Yeah, so you read this more as Trump getting closer to the Russia-China relationship rather than trying to break it up.
Yeah, there's one reading is that you have that Trump sees this as a kind of a post-World War II situation where big countries, where the Yalta Conference, where you had Russia, the US and Britain, and that this is kind of similar, that the US, China and Russia get to decide the fate of smaller countries. Now, that's an alarming possibility, but going on, and you can't read too much into the statements, and with Trump it's always what he does and not what he says. However, what he's said so far is pretty alarming when it comes to these kind of possibilities.
It's completely fascinating. I do wonder, you've been watching this pageantry unfold for so many years in China. You've seen Xi Jinping develop an increasingly authoritarian rule over the economy. What kind of economic legacy do you think he wants to leave behind?
I think with the legacy issue with Xi Jinping, it's very interesting. There's obviously people make parallels between Xi Jinping and the imperial system, the former emperors, and you always wanted to expand your territory. And I think Taiwan is in his thinking about that. Very hard to know whether he would ever go after Taiwan to that extent. He hasn't appointed a successor, and he's in his early, he's 70 now, 71, and he hasn't appointed a successor yet. So we don't really know what kind of. He certainly doesn't want to leave a legacy in that way, in a traditional sense. I think that the tech stuff is interesting. I think he likes the idea of leaving a modern, world-beating Chinese economy. I think in his thinking, he probably wants China to be the number one economy in the world and to leave it that way and to have overtaken the US. I think that drives an awful lot of what happens, not just with Xi Jinping, but an awful lot of what happens in China is to beat the US. And certainly in the way that with the tariffs, China has reacted so far, but it's gone tit for tat, which you would expect it to do, but it hasn't really done anything else. It hasn't even made that many angry comments. It's kind of kept relatively quiet about it. So I think that would tie in with the idea, maybe buy into the idea of him sort of seeing what happens, waiting. Chinese are very good at waiting. The Chinese government tends to wait these things out, so that could be part of it. But overall, his economic legacy, I think he likes the idea of a high-tech society that is number one in the world. I think that would be definitely what he wants. Whether that comes about is completely open.
And being number one economically, does he want the geopolitical power that comes with that, or is it more of a psychological thing?
I think it's both. I think he definitely wants the geopolitical power, and he wants China to be at the center of everything, and I think that would be a real achievement for him. The challenges for that will be that he can't seem to see beyond himself. The idea that he has enshrined himself at the heart of power in China without seeing what comes after him is a real risk to this image. And a lot of people are saying that maybe he hasn't, has he not thought it through, or does the Communist Party have other plans, or we'll never know because of this black box that we mentioned at the start of this talk. We don't know what decisions are being made in there, but using the NPC as our way into that black box, I think the high-tech thing is very, very important. The fact that the tech talks are going on, that he sees China as being a tech leader, and that could be instrumental, combined with the geopolitical things about the defense budget and looking at the region and growing its influence in the region. I think he would see that as having been a successful term as leader of the Chinese Communist Party.
So fascinating. Clifford, thank you so much for breaking it all down for us. Much appreciated.